Everyone, um, thank you for being here. So let me introduce our speaker today. We have Jenny Hellman. She is from the New West. She's the director of the Forest Carbon Program there, New West. She is a Michigan State alum as well. So we are happy to have one of our one graduate give a talk, come back and give a talk on a very appropriate topic in restoration efforts around the globe, and what does that mean to carbon as well? Is that correct?
Yeah.
So we are going to talk about that. And I will let Jenny speak more about herself, what she does, and then start the talk. Thank you all for coming.
All right, it's nice to meet all of you. Like you said, my name's Jenny Hellman. I'm gonna go in front of this. I'm the director of forest carbon for a company called Renew West. We're based out of Denver, but I actually sit in Tulsa, Oklahoma most of the time. And like you said, I did graduate from MSU as in their grad program for forest carbon, but I actually never came to campus because it was all remote and all COVID. So I'm excited to be here with you guys and actually get to be a real Spartan now, maybe. Like, I've been told I have to go to a football game in the snow to actually be a Spartan, so I guess I'll have to wait on that one. But all right, so I will give you just a little bit of background on myself, how I ended up in the forest carbon space, how I ended up at MSU. And then I'm going to talk through 3 projects that I worked on in the past 5 years and give you just an overview of the projects, what they look like from a carbon perspective, and then walk you through what we've learned working in that space. And I'll give you a little bit of a sneak peek. It's not all success stories. So part of what we are doing is also trying to just talk about what we've learned, what's going wrong, how we're getting better at it, where we're at right now. So you'll see some of that weaved throughout it, but just so you know, if there are some kind of sad moments to this story. And then I'll finish it up with just some reflections on how we're thinking about forest carbon right now. Here's the types of projects we're looking at, and just kind of what I've learned from working in the space. And then Q&A does not have to wait to the end. So if you guys have questions in the middle, just stop me and I can address them then, or we can do them at the end. Okay, so who am I? Like I said, I'm Jenny. I currently live in Oklahoma. These are some of my kids and my husband, and I have to throw a cute kid photos in there. And I did not start in the forestry space. So I'm not a forester by background. When I first came to MSU, like I didn't know what DBH was, like you guys are talking another language, like what is happening right now? So I actually started out in the engineering space. I got a bachelor's in petroleum engineering almost 20 years ago now, which is kind of crazy. And that's where I started. So I spent the first decade, 15 years working in that space, working mostly in Oklahoma and in Texas, drilling new wells. And then 2020 happened, and like a lot of people, I think there was some extra margin, some extra space, and I started looking at, okay, I'm in an industry that clearly has quite a bit of emissions. Like, what can I do in this space to be helpful? I won't tell you the whole long story, but basically where I landed is I'm sitting in Oklahoma. I did a bunch of research and worked with Oklahoma State University to think through what's a type of project we could do in our state that would reduce emissions, and how could we work with the oil and gas industry? Because that was my background. Like, how can we bring together those two pieces? And while I was working on that, I realized I have zero forestry experience. I don't really know the forest carbon world. Like, I'm passionate about my space in the world, but I don't have the technical background to do this. And so I went looking for how can I learn quickly in this space. And honestly, I was looking for like a 2-week short course, which in hindsight is hysterical, but that's what I was looking for. And I couldn't find it. And instead I found Michigan State program and their grad school certificate. And I thought, okay, I mean, 3 grad school courses can't kill me too badly. Like, let's try this. I maybe overestimated how hard it was going to be, but it was also amazing. So that's how I jumped into the forest carbon space, was through the MSU's program. And now, fast forward 3 years later, I work at Renew West, and that's my full-time job, is working in the forest carbon space. Okay, so I know you're supposed to do thank yous at the end, but I'm going to start with thank yous because honestly, I would not be in this space if it weren't for how kind and helpful the professors were at MSU. So I just threw all their lovely photos off the internet on there. But David and Kylie and Runching all taught the actual courses I had. Lauren and Daniel have been cheerleaders in the space, and then Raju and Chris have both been really helpful as we also work on some forest carbon biomass related projects. So I just wanted to say thank you, because honestly, I like showed up as an engineer in these courses and knew nothing, and they were all very helpful. They could have been like, go home. They were very nice. I also want to thank Oklahoma Forestry Services and Oklahoma State University, because they were our initial on-the-ground partners as we were learning the space. I've had many Oklahoma foresters take me around the woods, try to get me up to speed. So I just want to also thank them for their help. Okay, so let's jump in. So on the forest carbon side, I'm going to walk you through 3 projects that we worked on, and I'll kind of outline it like this. It'll first be, here's what the project is, here's the carbon specifics of it, and then here's lessons learned from that specific project. And the lessons range everything from like technical lessons to stakeholder lessons to financing lessons. So they go all kind of across the gamut. So the first project, which is the one that got me into this space, was focused on Southeast Oklahoma. And in case you guys don't know, most people think Oklahoma and they think like all pasture, grazing, western prairies like that. But the whole eastern third of the state used to be forested in kind of a savanna type ecosystem. But a lot of that has been deforested over the past 200 years. So what we were looking at is, could you add trees back into the landscape in those deforested areas? What the carbon world would call degraded land, we learned quickly, do not call landowners and tell them their land is degraded. Like, that's not a good place to start. Like, that was lesson number 1. Like, a carbon methodology might call it degraded land, but don't say that to your landowner. For you guys, I left it on there because it's the technical term. But so for this particular project, it was for voluntary markets. So this is for companies making pledges to reduce their carbon emissions, not compliance, not like California markets. We were working under the American Carbon Registry, which is considered one of the big 4 registries in the space. And the specific methodology that we were using, which is basically the rules of how you do a carbon project, is called this afforestation and reforestation of degraded lands. Those types of projects span 40 years. So we were talking to landowners about, are you willing to make a commitment for 40 years for your land? Long time horizons for carbon projects. The potential scale of the project is what we were looking at, is how big could this be if it really took off, if we had excited landowners. Over 3 million acres of Oklahoma used to be forested that aren't forested anymore. And again, this is with more savanna type forests, so not super dense forests in some other parts of the world, but considered forested. So that was the running room. We thought, I mean, you're not going to get 3 million acres of landowners to agree, but it was a large area to start with. So we thought if we can get a smaller subset of that, we could have quite a lot of running room just in the state of Oklahoma. It's also right on the edge of what is considered productive timberland, which has some benefits if you're doing a carbon project, because you can show this is additional to what would be doing in the normal timber industry. Like, it would probably not make money in these counties to just go full on timber. So it works pretty well from a carbon standpoint. Our pilot project that we were starting with was somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 acres, dependent on landowner buy-in. That's about how big of a project you need to justify all the costs that go into a carbon project. And we were estimating on average 5.5 tons of carbon, metric tons of carbon would be, or sorry, metric tons of CO2 would be sequestered per acre over the 40-year life. So you guys are foresters or going to be foresters. I don't have to tell you, like, it's not a straight line, like it's not 5 metric tons in the first year, but over the average of the 40 years, that's what we were looking at. So if you could get scale of land, it could be pretty impactful from how much carbon you could sequester. Okay, so our project partners, I finally got to my tree photos. I had to put them in here. Our project partners for this were Oklahoma Forestry Services, Oklahoma State University. We were working with six different nurseries across the South US, because the volume of seedlings we needed was way more than what any one nursery could supply, which was also a early learning, because again, my non-forester self called nurseries and said, hey, I want 4 million seedlings. And they're like, who are you? Like, so we had to learn that also, like what's the infrastructure, who can supply these seedlings, what's the lead time, like all of that. We also worked with some regionally focused land brokers. We call them landmen in oil and gas, but basically the people that would go out and talk to all of the landowners. Those initial conversations work much better if it's a person that lives in the community. And then if you have interested landowners who want more information, then we would follow up with them once that relationship was already established. And then we had so many local foresters who were our advisors and cheerleaders, also healthy pushback when we would come up with bad ideas. So they were also out there keeping us in check, making sure what we were designing really actually made sense for our area of the world. Okay, project timeline. Oh, the photos, these were seedlings that we were growing. So the top is black walnut, which is the native species to Oklahoma, and then loblolly pine, which is also native to far south. So those are, and these were in the nursery. That's not how close they were. I meant those are just tiny seedlings that then we were going to move to their final spots. So the timeline on this one, the bulk of the work happened in 2021 and 2022, and this was 2 years of stakeholder engagement, talking to landowners, working with foresters, working with nurseries, building out all the background work you need to be able to do a project like this, talking with planting crews, figuring out what types of landscapes would work the best, everything from like the mayor of the closest town to the nonprofits working in the forestry space, like all gamut of anyone you can imagine you might be interested in tree planting in Oklahoma with someone we tried to talk with. And then our planned planting window was 2023. Oklahoma planting is mid-January to mid-March, depending on snowfall. Here's where the sad part comes in. For this, we spent the 2 full years trying to find project financing, and at the end of the day, the cost per acre were higher than what people were willing to pay to actually do the reforestation work. And we had to put the project on pause. So it is still, there's still landowner interest, there's still interest in the types of projects, but the willingness to actually pay landowners to change what they're currently doing to shift to forestry, it wasn't there at the time. We haven't given up on it, but that's where it's sitting right now, is that initial inflow of dollars wasn't there for this type of project right now. So I jumped the gun a little bit, but so what did we learn? So much, I'll just say that, so much. But I think I'll kind of break it into a couple of different buckets. The first one is on what I'm calling stakeholder engagement. And this is really understanding the communities that you are working in. And I'll be honest, I underestimated this. In the oil and gas space, actually, Chris and I were just talking about this morning, like in the oil and gas space, you have very minimal conversations with your surface owners because most of what you're doing is under the ground. It is impacting them on a macro level, but on a surface level, it's a 5-inch hole. So like they're not, the rig is there for 60 days and then it leaves, and what they're left with is like smaller than the size of the spring. So the impact over decades to the surface is very, very small. But this is completely different. If you're asking a landowner to change their entire way of life to support a carbon project. So the amount of time that you need to spend just to explain what you're even trying to do is really long. But then to try to figure out does what you're proposing even make sense for those landowners also just takes a lot of time. And what we did not account for going into it is that we were going to landowners who largely had pasture land. So they were raising cattle, and they would tell you, I'm not making money off raising my cattle. Like, I can show you my books. Like, I just like having land, like not really making money off the cows. And then you show them like, well, I can make you this much money off carbon. And their response is, cool, I'm a cattle rancher. Like, okay, so we didn't, I mean, that's not every landowner, but it was very common. We underestimated the culture that we were walking into. We didn't think through how is the messaging coming across, like how are we explaining this? Also, in case you don't know, Oklahoma is like a fully red state, and we were talking about climate. So like we were starting at some weird spots just from like high level. What are we even trying to do? So there was a lot of just getting to know the community and then getting to know us. And it honestly, it took years. And now almost 4.5 years after the initial conversations, we frequently had landowners call us to want to talk about carbon, but it took a long time just to have that initial base of trust built. We knew that 40 years was a long time, but what we then learned from the demographics is that the landowners are almost all in their 70s and 80s. So you're asking them to make a commitment that's going to impact their kids. So we also needed to think through what's the generational impacts of what we're asking them to do. This is not just them, like they'd be committing their children or the next owners of the land to something that lasts 40 years. So thinking through that piece of it. And then maybe the biggest piece is that we also needed to think through better, what risks are we asking of the landowners? They're currently making money off their cows, or at least maybe not breaking even, but they're making some. And you're asking them to fully change their land to a forest, which one is completely different than what they've been doing, but also you're asking them to take a market risk that carbon is going to take off and they're going to make money off of it. And that may not be something that's really fair to be asking the landowners to do. So thinking through like how much risk are you putting on the landowner when you ask them to change what they've been doing. So that's kind of all landowner engagement questions. Then we also just learned some nitty-gritty project design, like probably don't start with 4,000 acres. Like even though that's what it needed for a carbon project, like that's really a lot of money for an investor or for a philanthropy. It's also like we ordered every season in 4 states. Like that's not really reasonable. Like that's probably not the best place to start. Like the infrastructure was just not there. We were going to have to pull like all planting crews in a bunch of states together for 6 weeks. Like it was just logistically going to be very hard to do. So maybe start a little smaller with that first bite. And then nurseries, again, are a really integral part of the equation, and the infrastructure in the US right now around nurseries doesn't really support these large scale projects. And there's a lot of risk involved with the nurseries if they're growing seedlings for you that you may turn around and not use because your financing doesn't work out, which is what happened to us. So we had like 2.5 million loblolly pines that never got planted because the financing didn't happen. So figuring out how to partner better with nurseries for the long term and have flexible financing so that they're not run out to dry if you don't move forward with your project. And then another piece is, and again, you guys as in the forestry world probably would have gone into it eyes wide open on this. I was more like, I'm doing the carbon project, thinking through the full ecosystem effects of what you're doing. So you could plant all loblolly pine and it will probably sequester enough carbon over 10 to 20 years. But what does that do to your wildlife? What does that do to your biodiversity? What does that do to your ice damage risk in Oklahoma? Like, what does it do to have only one species? Like, even if that is optimized for carbon, not really optimized for your ecosystem long term. So thinking through how do we restore forest that is resilient and can be adapted to future climate changes? Like, how do we build all of that vision? In case you're not picking up on it, it gets very complex. Like that was maybe the biggest learning of the whole thing is it's like you go in thinking, I'm going to plant trees. And then at the end of the day, it's all of these moving pieces. You won't get bored. That's the upside, I guess. And then lastly, just the project time. It takes a long time to plant a carbon project if you're doing reforestation. The order time on seedlings is it's probably 18 months before you want to put them in the ground. You have to backtrack that far. It takes 2 to 3 years to get landowners on board. You have to get your planting crews. Like it's a long cycle time. And all of that needs to have funding to support it or the projects don't have it. So just understanding that part of it. Oops, I'm going the wrong way. Sorry, let me go this way. Okay, so then and this one's the longest because I worked this the most closely, so I have the most like personal learnings over it. The other 2 are a little bit shorter, just so you guys don't get nervous. On the project financing side, so we did have a project financer who was working with us at the beginning, who was going to do milestone-based payments. And we just needed to have clearer and more frequent decision points on if we're going to go or no go on this project. We kind of had it, our vision was we have 2 break points, like Breakpoint one, do all the design, all the feasibility, get the landowners on board, sign a landowner, and then you go. Like that's that's the only breakpoint, and that was not enough breakpoints for the financer or for us. We got too far out in front, and the financer was too far back, and it didn't align. So we need to have more frequent check-in points where you say, are we all still on board? Are we all still going forward with this project? I think you also need to just make sure you really understand the motivations of who you're talking to for financing, whether that's private dollars, philanthropy. What they tell you in a first meeting might not actually be what their main motivations are. So trying to really understand, like, are we all doing these projects for the same reasons? Because that's going to affect how strong your financial needs will look for them to be interested in the project long term. So making sure you understand that. And then I think my biggest learning of the whole thing, of all projects, which I'll come back to at the end, is that you have to have face-to-face time with all your parties. We were good about the face-to-face time with the landowners because we lived in Oklahoma. We were talking to the foresters every day, talking to the landowners. We were in the community, but that face-to-face time with the financiers was a break. They never met us in person. They never met the landowners in person. There was a disconnect there. So figuring out ways to get the dollars also involved in the face-to-face, I think will go a long time or a long way towards just smoother project dynamics the whole way. And like Grace, it was COVID. There were reasons why we were not in person, but I think in hindsight, that was really a detriment to the projects because there was no personal connection between what was happening on the ground and what was in the spreadsheet. Like it was too far apart. I think I've gone through most of the key takeaways, but I would say big takeaway is just to listen to all of the parties involved. Like, I'm an engineer, I want to move fast, and like, show me a spreadsheet and let's go. And what I didn't appreciate is that you really have to listen to every person involved in the project to understand why are they in it, what's their motivation, why do they want to be here. And really MSU's class that they do on the community and stakeholder engagement really helped with that because I had not had a course like that before, and it kind of set a framework around here's all the things that could be going on in people's minds. You could say, I want to plant trees for a forest carbon project. Like it's taking time to really learn what is everyone thinking here. And then I think alongside with that, really allowing for this principle called co-design, which is instead of me as the project developer or New West coming in and saying, here's the project, sign on the dotted line and I'll pay you a bunch of money. Like really taking the time to design the full project with your people that live in it. So taking input on species that they want on their land, taking input on whether or not to still include cattle in the design, taking input on the time length and the contract terms, like all of that, really listening and saying, how can we build this in a way that works for all of the parties, as opposed to just putting a solution in front of people and then expecting them to say, yes, I'm good. It doesn't work. It really doesn't work. It's longer on the front end to do all of that work, but then on the far end, you have, within the carbon world, we call it a durable solution because everyone's actually bought in on what you're putting in front of them. And then on the funding side of things, I think where we've landed, but this is also in flux, honestly, because we're still learning as we go, is I think there is a need for more flexible and probably non-dilutive, and by that I mean like grants or philanthropy that is funding that early work to understand your stakeholders. That's a really hard thing for private financiers to want to fund, a whole other conversation. But I think if there are some sources of non-dilutive dollars that let you do that year or two of stakeholder work before you have to go to a financer and say, here's my project design, that will go a really long way. So that's something we're working on now as project developers, is trying to figure out what groups are willing to support that work. So you can go and have the space to really design a project that works for the community, works for the space, works long-term, versus trying to shove it into really fast timelines to satisfy finance holders. And then I think I already said this, but encourage personal relationships between all the parties, not just landowners and project developers, but also all the way from your purchaser of carbon credits down to landowners. I like to think of it as you really have two end users, like if you were marketing an app, if you have one end user, but in carbon, you really have two end users. You have your landowner and you also have your carbon purchaser. So both parties need to be happy or your project doesn't for the more long term. And then lastly, what we are looking at now on this is actually with all the input from landowners around cattle, different income streams, we are re-looking at what's called the silvopasture approach. Maybe all you guys know what that meant. I didn't 2 years ago, but it basically is allowing for cattle and trees together. So you have a much less dense forest. It's still within what the USDA considers as forest or through their forest service definitions. But it's just much fewer trees and frequently different species that may allow for actual forage that the cattle can eat. So like it's dropping their nuts or leaves that cows can eat, and it helps feed them alongside getting shade, reduction of heat effects, like all of those extra benefits. But maybe the biggest part for landowners is it lets them keep their cattle income. So you can have the short-term cattle income and then the longer-term carbon and potentially timber income. So it's just a lower risk option. Clearly you have less trees per acre, so your carbon sequestered per acre does go down. But if you get way larger buy-in from landowners in the long term, it might be a more plausible solution. So we're reevaluating the project with that right now, trying to see if that could work. But that's a whole different project design. So having to redo all of it for that. Okay. Questions on that one before I go to the next one? It's really too much. Okay, we'll do the next one.
Can I
Yes,
ask you a question?
yes,
So it's about the silver pasture,
yes.
and do they have to have different species of the trees for specific that purpose?
So you don't have to. I mean, you can do silvopasture with loblolly pine. You just do a less dense planting, and then the loblolly is giving shade, but it's not really giving food to the cows. Or you can try to do it more to where it's tailored to what the cows might eat. So like black locust, they can spend the leaves, or like if it's black walnuts, they can eat the shells and holes. Like, so you can do it more for the food. It kind of just depends on your landowner priorities and what grows well in the space. And I will say that's one of the challenges is that silvopasture, while it's been practiced around the world for a long time, like in the US, going and finding experts in silvopasture is pretty hard as compared to trying to find somebody who can help you do a pine plantation. Like that's more common. So the extension services around silvopasture are harder to manage, and that's part of what we're trying to work on now is how do you build out those resources? How do you know what types of trees? How do you know what density of trees? Like how do you build that back? Good question. Yeah.
And Dr. Score for that question.
Oh, yes. How do I don't know. How do I let him talk?
Maybe you can just hear me.
Okay, yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, those of us who are attending on Zoom aren't visible, it looks like, but we're here. I'm here anyway.
I can see your hand.
Yeah. Okay, good. Nice to hear what you have to say. Very interesting. And I know we have a time set aside tomorrow to talk more, but I had a quick question.
Yes.
And that is, you're talking about this this issue of financing and all the complexities that go with that, and I can appreciate that. But what I'm wondering is, are you looking at a range of financial instruments or financial mechanisms besides just purchasing the carbon, so-called carbon credits? Like there's a lot of discussion in the area I work, which is not domestically, it's international, but they're working, the work is with smallholders. We're doing a lot of work with Rabobank, the Dutch bank that's investing in smallholders in agroforestry.
Yep.
And, so they're looking at a lot of instruments like forward purchase agreements, for example. And a forward purchase agreement means that there's a buyer that's not only interested in the carbon offsets, but also in the products that might be produced, whether it's precious woods or some sort of fruit product or some other kind of product. And that to some degree alleviates the generational problem or the long-term delayed benefits problem, because it doesn't really take the land out of production. It actually, the carbon investments make those lands more investable, more productive because they have that secondary product that they're producing, as well as the carbon removals, and that's built into an instrument that the financer or the buyer agrees to buy a certain amount of those products once they become those trees become mature and can be harvested.
Yeah, okay, so I would say high level, we have thought about it in the sense of when we think about silvopasture projects, we're trying to think through, is there a way to add value to the actual beef that's being produced on the land alongside of the trees? We haven't quite looked at would the trees themselves bring additional value from agroforestry, but it's a good point. I do think we're trying to get creative with how many different kinds of revenue streams can we layer, because I think what we have learned is that if carbon is your only source of income from the land, it's a really hard sell for everyone. It's a hard sell for the landowners, it's a hard sell for the financiers. So if you can bring in stackable income like you're talking about, that's probably a better approach. I don't think we have a magic answer identified for this specific space, but so yes, I think it's a good point, and thanks for adding it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so then the next project that we worked on, actually is a little bit out of order because I wanted to build off the learnings versus timeline. But the second project that I got to work on with the New West was in the Peruvian Amazon. And this project was, or is, working on silvopasture, which is kind of actually where I got back to silvopasture in Oklahoma, because the whole year I was working on this, I thought, this is an approach you could do in Oklahoma. And everyone kept asking us, can I keep my cows? And here's how we could do it. So this particular project inside of Peru, there's this one giant highway it's giant for Peru, it would not be giant in the US, but this one highway that runs through the Peruvian Amazon into Brazil. And all along that highway, there is massive deforestation for cattle farming. And what we were looking at is there a way to reverse that trend? Is there a way to replant trees in that area? Is there a way to create livelihoods for people in the space? Because they're deforesting so that they can eat. I mean, it's not like they're deforesting so they can have cows that can feed themselves and their families. So it's a systemic challenge on how to create livelihoods. And part of the issue in the Amazon is that the soil, once the trees are gone, is so lacking in nutrients that after only 2 to 3 years, it can't even really support the cattle. So it's like they cut the trees down, feed the cattle for a few years off of the grasses, and then it's dead. Like it cannot support life anymore because the soil is so thin. So what we were trying to do is, can we work in that context and come up with a solution that's going to allow for trees to be replanted and hopefully lead to less deforestation, because they can still support their cattle without needing to go cut down more trees because the current pastures aren't working. So this is a picture outside of Madre de Dios in Peru. This was where we were looking at doing our initial pilot site. So you can see, like, this is the edge rainforest, and they deforested all of this portion. And this is actually an invasive, not native grass. That is what, and the cows don't even like it, but that's what's there. This was going to be a voluntary project. Again, not compliance. This one is actually using VERA's verified carbon standard. You know about the carbon space. This methodology is pretty new, but it's for reforestation. Our goal was to start with around 100 hectares, which that's what this area is here that you're seeing. And we would plant it over 3 years, because if you're doing a silvopasture project, you actually do it kind of in thirds, or at least the way we were looking at it. You fence off a portion, plant that while your cows stay in the other part, because the cows will eat the trees if you don't do that. So fence them off for a year or two. In the Amazon, it grows really fast, so a year is about long enough till they're tall enough to where the cows won't destroy them. So plant it in thirds and rotate the cow with fencing. A key point on this one is that fencing costs have come way, way down. So now you can move electric fences around pretty quickly. You can actually run them off solar. So you could do a project like this now that 10 years ago probably wouldn't have been feasible, because the fencing got so expensive. The expansion goal, we said 30,000 hectares over the next 5 to 10 years. There's so much more running room than that if you can get the buy-in, but even that number is gonna be really hard to do functionally, which I'll talk about on the next slide. And then the average on this is about 18 tons per hectare. So that's like 7-ish tons per acre. And that is, it's basically a row design. So you have a row of trees and then a row of cows. I mean, I think they can go into, but that's kind of what it's like. So trees, cows, trees, cows. And this actually is, to your question earlier, a species that the cows can eat the leaves. So it gives additional benefits from a health standpoint to cows. They're not just eating grass, they're also eating the leaves, which I think I have a picture. Yeah, so this is, it's called Inga etilis, and this is the bean pod thing from it. That's not the technical term, but that's what it looks like. It looks like bean pods inside of it. But the cows can also eat that, so they can eat the leaves and they eat that and additional nutrients to cows. And this project also, apart from the climate impacts of it, had a really big workforce development piece. So the researcher we've been working with down there has also been doing a lot of work with training women to work in small scale nurseries. And so they would be part of the workforce that was supporting this project. And it gives additional income and livelihood to women. And in this culture specifically, it's a flexible income, so they can do it alongside raising children. So it gives them that flexibility to have that income while still being with their families. So that was part that was fun to just see that part of like empowering women making money and just giving them more flexibility to their lives. So on this one, our project partners on the ground, we had Dr. Doblin, who's a university professor who had been working down there for almost a decade. So we were building off of all of her stakeholder engagement work. She had worked through silvopasture designs, had done research on the Inga etilis, had done research on how it affected cows. We were building on all of this research that she'd been doing and all of this community building that she had already done. And then Camino Verde was our nursery partner there. I'll talk about this more on the next slide, but they were amazing. But also the scale was so small compared to what we needed. That part of the challenge was how do you scale that nursery infrastructure to support something this big. And then AGRAP is, I'll butcher the Spanish, so I won't do it, but it's in alliance with regenerative cow ranchers and research organizations, nonprofits that have all come together to try to figure out how can we do cattle ranching in the Amazon in a way that doesn't seem to cut off the rainforest. I think deforestation free cattle is like their tagline. So working with them as well. So the upside of this is that a lot of the stakeholder engagement and that early listening around what type of design works had already been done before we ever got there. The timeline on this, I think I just went through all the background, but the 2023, we spent doing feasibility work, project design work. We went down to Peru, we met with the nursery, we met with the team on the ground. And then we were going to plant our pilot project in January of this year. And what we determined, go to the next. Honestly, on this one, I think we missed that our partners on the ground's goals were not the same as ours. And carbon would have been an amplifying effect to what they were doing. But we were really focused on carbon and they were really focused on regenerative ranching, and we kept running into some hurdles because frankly, the carbon methodology wasn't written to support a cattle project. And so we kept kind of trying to shove a carbon project onto what they were already doing. And we ran into some struggles and we felt like we need to hit pause. We're not all on the same page. Like we're also trying to manage this from 1,000 miles away in Oklahoma. We need to rethink how we're going to do this if we're going to move forward. But with that as a background, some of the other things that we learned for this particular project, I don't know if you guys know about this theory of change idea, but this project really did have a robust theory of change. So a lot of work has been done around deforestation is happening. Why is it happening? How do we stop it? What works for landowners? How do we build a solution that's fit for this context that also works for the climate? So this project had that. A lot of that work had already been done. The infrastructure was really limited. My pictures of Peru don't really do it justice, but like, so this is us. in the largest nursery in the region. They were growing 50,000 seedlings for us, and that was their max of what they could do. And just not the infrastructure of the US. There's one main road throughout basically all of eastern Peru. There's not tractor infrastructure, there's not workforce to support large plantings. It's a very different operating arena than in the US, which probably sounds weird to say, but until you're down there, it's kind of hard to grasp like how different it is from like going to the Oklahoma State Nursery or the Michigan State Nursery. Like that's not what you're working with. And it's hard enough in the US, like the infrastructure is not really enough to support what we're doing, but here it was really hard. There's also regulatory challenges in Peru. At the time we were there, they were redoing their national forest emissions level. And while they were redoing that, you really couldn't do any RED projects, which are there to stop deforestation. And we were trying to do this like tag team approach of stopping deforestation while reforesting. And so it got really complicated from a methodology and regulatory standpoint, like what type of project are you doing? So that was kind of all in the background. And also Peru has this law around ownership within 50 kilometers of the border for national security, and everything we were doing was within 50 miles or 50 kilometers of the border. And we started to realize it's going to be really hard for a foreign company to hold leases on land for 40 years when you're within the border and you're in the spot they don't really want foreigners to have control of the land. So then do you have this big regulatory risk that you are just going ahead with and you're not sure how it's going to end up? You can get exemptions, but they take a long time. So it's just all of these things that inside the US are a little more clear and straightforward when you move to international projects, at least in Peru. They get more complicated. It does not mean the project should not happen. Like, please do not hear that. I just think there are different, like when you look at the US, the costs per acre or per hectare are higher, but there's some reasons for it because you have this built-in stability of infrastructure and a pretty set regulatory system, and even things as small as like contracts, like a landowner there, like getting them to sign a 10-page contract, like that's something they've never looked at before. They may not have, like their land may not be titled, they may not have, it might be like owned by someone else, but they work on it. Like there's just all of these things that were more fluid than they are in the US that make it just a riskier place to do business. Again, it doesn't mean it shouldn't happen. It's just something you have to take into account. And I think also kind of what we learned is you have to have flexibility in your timing because things are going to come up that you're not expecting. Having worked mostly in the US, and you have to adjust. You might have to expand your timeline, and you just need to plan for that. And then I think on the partner side, I kind of mentioned it already, but we just learned you really have to have alignment of goals on like, why are we doing this project? Like, it's a carbon project, it's a regenerative ag project, it's a cattle project, it's all of the above. Like, all answers are fine, but we all need to have the same answer, or this is going to get really, it's not going to go very well. And I think again, lesson learned, you have to have face-to-face communication. In a year, I was down there once, it's not enough. Like our on-the-ground team needed FaceTime with them. So that brings into question, like, are you the right team for it? If you're sitting 1,000 miles away, like, how do you really do this? Do you either relocate, move there? Like, how do you get all that communication working well? All right, I'm gonna have to go. I think I went through all those. Okay, I'm gonna do the last one really fast and give you guys time for questions. The last one is the one that worked, so I left the best one for last. We have Renew West's largest project is a 10,000 acre wildfire restoration project in Northern California. This is a compliance project, so not voluntary, under California's compliance market. 10,000 acres of ponderosa pine. This is an actual shot from the visit. So here's the ponderosa pine, and this is the wildfire burn area and the path back that you can still see. We planted 2 million seedlings. It is a really slow growth area though. There's barely any rainfall. It's going to take a very long time for those trees to get big, but they are there and they're planted. We also on this project, I think one of the big reasons for success, we partnered with a timber company. they've been around since the 1800s. They have decades of experience in how to implement forestry projects in their area of the world. So we got a leg up from the very beginning, and our partners do this every day. We also had grant dollars from CAL FIRE for the beginning costs on it. They do not cover the full project life, but they do cover the early planting costs. So that gave us some flexibility in how to do the project design in a way that really worked for us and the landowners. Ruby Canyon Environmental did our verification. I don't think you're technically supposed to call them partners, they're a third party, but they verified the project to make sure we followed all the rules. And just to give you an idea of even on a successful project, the timeline is really long. So first site prep was in 2020, which I think was about 5 to 7 years after the burn happened. And then planting happened in winter or January of 2022. We finished verification with the Climate Action Reserve in August of 2023. And then since it's a compliance project, there's an additional step with California Air Resource Board. That was February of 2024. So 4 years from like site prep to where the project gets a checkbox that says you did a good carbon project. That does not mean there's revenue from it. So because of the growth of the seedlings, we're deferring when we're going to issue the first credits on that project because they're so small. Like this was a couple weeks ago. So this is a 2-year-old seedling and it's about 18 inches tall right now. Not big enough to justify going through the paperwork to issue credit. So even on a successful project, it's going to probably be a decade before those trees make money as a carbon project. This one, again, we partnered with experts in the space. That goes a long way towards the project going smoothly. We co-designed the project with them. They were already foresters. We were working alongside them to complement what they were trying to do. This is a conservation easement, so it will be forested lands forever. And then they already had established nursery partnerships, seedling sourcing mechanisms that they worked on as a timber company. So all of that was already established, but it still requires a lot of patience for the timeline. So even with all of those partners, grant funding, everything already established from infrastructure, it's still challenging. All right. So I'm just going to leave this list of questions up here, but this is kind of what do I ask now when I'm looking at a carbon project? Now that I've gone through 3 cycles, I've learned all of this, I've seen what can go wrong, what can go right, like what do I look at now? First and foremost is have we really done enough stakeholder engagement? Do we really understand what the communities want? We didn't even really talk about co-benefits in here, but what are the additional benefits to the landowner for doing those projects? Like David said, what are additional income streams they may be getting? What workforce development is happening? Like all of those pieces that are involved, understanding that. And then really understanding the timelines and what are the risks to timelines, which is something I did in my oil and gas life as a project manager, but the margins in carbon are really skinny. So you have to just leave yourself the flexibility for your timeline to get a little off without it sinking the whole project. And then I'm calling this adaptive project design, but again, this ties back to taking input from your community. Is there enough space in how you structured your financing, structured your deals, that if you get input from the community, you can actually change your design? And this is, I think, one of the most challenging parts is a lot of times you lock up your funding for a project before you really have all the input you need. And then you're trapped in this design that may not actually be what works well for the community and for the actual ecosystem you're working in. So how do you make sure that your upfront financing gives you the flexibility to take that feedback and adjust your project design? And then, are you the right team to be doing the project? I think that's what we learned on the Peru project. We weren't the right team. And it wasn't the right set of partners. We didn't have alignment of goals. We were living too far away and weren't able to relocate to the actual spot that the trees were being planted in. We weren't the right combination. And being willing to realize that even though you may have a lot of excitement and fervor for climate space work, like sometimes you're not the right person. So like which sucks because you want to do it. Sorry, I'm not supposed to say that, but like you want to be the person to do it. It was amazing to go to Peru, but then at the end of the day, it's like this is not the right set of people to do. So being willing to say that, And then again, is it financeable? How do you make sure that what you're building can actually be paid for? Because you may have the perfect project design, can't get financing, it doesn't happen. So, and financing doesn't have to be private, it can also be philanthropy, non-dilutive grants. Like I just mean, are you designing something that people are willing to pay for? And then lastly, again, have you actually talked to people face to face? Like, I think you just, it's projects that have to do with land, and people have strong affinity to their land. And so if you are not out there actually talking to them in their space, in their environment, it's really hard to know what you're proposing and what they want. So I would just say the more frequently you can get in the face of your project partners, in the face, maybe that's other person, in the same room as your project partners, better. And then this is my very last one, which, all right, this is outside of forestry, but this is what I feel like I also learned is that I think you get into this space because you want to do good, you want to work on ecosystem restoration, you want to work with landowners. And I think you just have to remember, like, we're all learning together. No one knows exactly how to do these projects when you start. So this is just like my list of traits I think that you should work on in this space. But I think you have to be willing to be curious, to ask a lot of questions of the people around you. You have to have a growth mindset because you're going to get it wrong sometimes. I did, and you have to be willing to take the feedback and say, there's a better way of doing it. Let's adjust course, let's pause. I think you have to have resilience and grit. Like I just showed you, only 1 out of 3 projects got planted, and that's not only my experience. So it's a hard space to be in. So you have to just be ready for that. But then I also think there's so much collaboration in the space and so much excitement around the good that can be done. So leaning into that and letting other people help you when things are rough. Like I think that, that's all of life, but I saw it play out in this space as well. And then I'm just gonna put the last one is joy, because I think if you don't really love the work you're doing, like it's just gonna be hard. So I think if you can find that external motivation of like, why are we doing these projects? Like what are we working for? How do we bring that energy to the space we're working in? Then that will go a long way towards crafting projects that actually work for all the parties involved. Okay, I didn't leave 15 minutes, but there is some time. So who has questions?
Yeah, I'm kind of wondering how this works compared to like a conservation easement. Like, do landowners get tax credits for installing these carbon projects on their land? Or
It's a good question. So oh yeah, so he's asking, is it like a conservation easement? Can landowners get tax credits? Like, how are they actually getting paid for the use of their land? Okay, conservation easements can be a part of a carbon project, but they are separate. So generally the conservation easement, they may get paid upfront for putting their land into a conservation easement. It depends on the state, the tax implications of that. So I don't know, every state, like a state specific question. Our reforestation project in California is in a conservation easement, so it will be a forest and forever, and it is also FSC certified. So those were all like pieces of the project. They're actually getting paid generally for the carbon in one way or another. So some projects are structured a flat payment per acre. So like we're going to pay you $10 per acre to do a carbon project. Some are tied to the actual carbon revenues. So like if we generate, I'm making up numbers, 100 carbon credits on your land, you'll get 50% of the profits when we sell them. So there's different ways, different instruments of doing it. Some are also, we're going to pay to give you all these trees and you get the timber revenue in 40 years, but we're not paying for the carbon. So it just depends. Yes, David, I see your hand.
Oh, good. Yeah, thank you, Jenny. That was a great presentation. I think it's so important for people to reflect on the challenges. Climate change mitigation has been talked about for over a decade, of course, but the actual experience base is pretty shallow. It's still a very new thing. And I think the last point you just made is really interesting, that there are so many different ways of doing the same thing. There's so many different financial instruments. There's many ways of of doing these nature-based solution approaches. There's all kinds of different things. There's no one thing that fits all situations as well. So it can be kind of complex and it's constantly changing. This is the challenge we have in teaching these courses, is that
Yeah.
you have to update it every other month, but you can't
Yeah.
really do that.
Yeah.
So I think that all this is really, really good. My question though is, so one of the big things that's going around the community now is, especially as we start talking about real terms about getting private capital and private investment and financing going, because we can't really move towards nature-based solutions without financing, and we have to
Right.
unlock that financing all
Yep.
over the world. It can't be donor driven. It can't be just these kind of philanthropic fund driven activities. Although I would point out that the Bezos Earth Fund is $1 billion philanthropic investment, which is not to sneeze at. But
Yeah.
nonetheless, how do you mobilize private capital? And the question keeps coming up on projects I'm working on. I'm working with some of the big banks right now on a big project, HSBC, Lloyd's of
Yeah.
London, BNP Paribas, et cetera, Bank of America.
Yep.
And they're saying in very blunt terms, okay, we get it, but what's the business case for doing this? What's the business case for nature-based solutions? And it's kind of soft language for how do we incorporate it into our business model, aka how do we make money off of nature-based solutions?
Yeah.
It's a fair question. It's a good question. There's an answer to it, but it's complicated. What's your sense on those? I think you're struggling with that too. I think in the early part of your presentation, you talked. How do you bring this to farmers? Because they're going to ask that. They're going to say, "What's the business case for me for doing this?" and all that.
Yeah. Well, okay. So I have two thoughts. I mean, the first thought is that we ran into this right into the wall, because our private financiers for the Oklahoma project, at the end of the day, they wanted to make money off of it, as opposed to seeing it as an operating cost for being a business that they should want to offset their emissions. They wanted to turn around and sell the carbon credits and make money. So we lived the challenge of trying to figure out, okay, is this actually something that can make a business money, or should it just be considered an operating cost, because we should all be doing our best to reduce emissions? I think practically where we've landed is, and maybe this is not the right answer for a carbon course, is that trying to focus less on carbon and more on the full benefits of what we're doing, and having carbon be a piece of it. But like for the silvopasture approach in particular, like looking at, okay, how can landowners actually make more money off of each acre before you even layer carbon in? And then that allows them to potentially want to do the work themselves with their own dollars instead of outside financing. I mean, if you were like a giant insurance broker, I would think you could connect the dots to seeing how climate risk is going to make your premiums insane. But I don't know if that is where everyone is going. Also, like food security issues and energy security issues that are all tied to climate change, but those are macro and a little hard to get some people to grasp. So I'd be curious what you tell them.
Well, we're working on it. It's not an easy thing to answer, but one of the starting points is one that we're not going to be familiar with living here in the United States of America. But if you lived in Europe, you would feel it. The citizens of Europe have strongly said to their governments that climate change is a problem. It's a risk. It's a risk to our livelihoods and to our businesses. And so now they have a number of regulatory regimes in place, similar to California, but in a way very different. They have the EU deforestation regulation that regulates the supply chain in 5 commodities, all tree-based commodities. It's all related to forestry, and it without going into a lot of detail about it, it's making companies and financial investors in those companies really think hard that how can we run these businesses like this with this kind of sentiment by the citizenry and also the regulatory response that comes with it. And so they're de-risking. So there's a huge amount of business case in de-risking your supply chain. If you can
Yeah.
get into measuring the scope 3 emissions and things like that. That's somewhat true in the United States, but lesser so. And I'm concerned these days that it's gonna die back even more. But there's still financial disclosure that's required.
Yeah,
So this is touching the big corporates, not so much farmers, which is another thing. But there's that kind of stuff.
yeah. Well, we can talk about it more tomorrow because I want the longer version.
Yeah, and it's not simple. It's complicated.
No,
but-
it's not. It's not simple. I do think also whatever we can do to make it less abstract, because for most people, if you try to explain a carbon project, it takes you like an hour to even explain it. Like that's a terrible marketing pitch. So like if there's a way to get it into language that's more digestible to a larger portion of the population, like I think that's a start. But
I think it's time. I think we can stop here and move to 206 for lunch. So you have a lot of opportunities there to ask questions and discuss that as well from online. Is there any more questions from online? If not, then I think let's do a round of applause. Thank you, Jenny, for accepting our invitation and coming and doing this talk.
of course.